we do know, and there are still things we don't know. So let me pull up some thoughts. I debated whether or not to have a full-blown presentation, walking through things, but to be honest with you, by the time I finished any presentation slides, they could have already become dated. Things are moving quickly over the past few days and the past few hours. So let me pull up a few thoughts. All right, first things first. I actually wanted to ask you about surprises or met expectations. Over the past few days, something I've tried to do with family members, friends, fellow social scientists I went to graduate school with, or just have been mentors along the way, is ask them things that they did expect to happen and did end up happening versus things that were completely unexpected, surprises. And that could be local, state, national. So, if I may, any surprises or everything one expected came to fruition? I'm getting a shaking of the head. Fortune favors the bold. So, surprises, no surprises?
Very surprised.
By everything?
Disappointed.
Surprised and disappointed. Okay.
Yeah.
Expectations were not only met but exceeded, and that was the well-being and safety of the poll workers.
That's true. Yeah.
I am not surprised by the shallowness of analysis, even from sources that I respect.
Okay. I hope not to then continue that challenge. If I do, feel free during the Q&A to push. And also, if anyone has questions during our conversation, feel free to just raise your hand or interject. That's more than fine. Yeah?
I think I was surprised by the number of young people, first-time voters, when I went. There were a number ahead of me that had never voted.
This is something we talk about in class all the time, but it used to be a truism. The young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, right, that youngest demographic that people oftentimes focus on in exit polls, that they just don't vote often enough. And they certainly don't vote often enough in midterm elections, but even in presidential elections, they don't vote frequently. But I try to push back a little bit and look at presidential election cycles going back to 2008. And we've actually seen some presidential election cycles in which 18 to 29-year-olds are very participatory. Very participatory. Yeah.
I heard on the way over here that the actual number of votes cast for president in this election was pretty much the same as 2020. And that didn't match with the news coverage that they were saying several people voted.
You were expecting to exceed the 2020 numbers?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, only based on the fact that all the news, all you heard was how many people
Sure.
ballots were cast.
Yes.
With
Yes.
that allusion to the fact that so many more people were voting.
Yeah.
Having been a big female and being older, I can't help but wonder. I feared that if the election went the way it appears to have gone, I can't help but think if Kamala Harris had been male and had been white, whether she would have been elected. And I'd be interested on your take if you think those factors made a difference.
I was surprised at the demographics of people voting and not voting for my preferred candidate.
Okay. Maybe one more and then we'll get going. Yeah.
So I was surprised. I have read Sunday this opinion piece by Maureen Dowd, and she talked about how character doesn't matter now. That's what is, coming about when you look at the elections and who gets in. That character doesn't matter. And I was really surprised about that because character is incredibly important to me.
Okay. This is a common exit question that's oftentimes offered up, not just in presidential election cycles, but even midterm cycles, which is what qualities of leadership did you want from X? President, senator, representative. And we have seen movement on this front over time. There have been elections in which character, even moral fitness, one might say, are the most important, or one of the top 2 or 3. Other times, those don't seem to be the most important leadership qualities. And in fact, those were not the most important leadership qualities in early exit polling. I'm going to probably use that little clause again and again this afternoon because it is true that we have some exit poll data, right? Pollster stops someone right when they leave the ballot booth and they ask them some questions. If you do it well enough, it does have similar dynamics to a well-run survey. But as any good political scientist will tell you, it gives you kind of a parameter. It doesn't necessarily give you the kind of fine-grained information about the electorate that we're going to get in a few weeks or a few months. So some of the data that's coming out about how many people voted, what they prioritized, what the biggest topics were for them, maybe breakdowns by race or ethnicity or income, view those as kind of a placeholder. We will get even finer grained information on that front in the weeks and months ahead. All right. So things I wanted to focus on. One, the election cycle, what it looked like kind of maybe over the past year. And then secondly, closing messages by the two presidential candidates. Third, questions that I had on election night, which could bode well for some candidates or not bode well for others. Next, what answers we have to those election night questions. And then some additional takeaways now that we are about 48 hours out. Sound good? Now, once again, stop me at any point if you vehemently disagree, want to push back, or just have additional questions about what I'm saying. All right, so first things first. What was clear before Tuesday? One thing that I keep on thinking about is, one, both how polarized the electoral season was, but also how unprecedented the electoral season was. Let's start with the polarization front. Bipartisanship has become a bad word in many parts in the United States. Compromise, consensus, reaching across the aisle doesn't necessarily have the same cultural cachet as it once did. And in fact, we're starting to see more and more negative polarization in the United States. What do I mean by negative polarization? Those that adamantly defend a candidate or a cause or a party, not because they necessarily believe in that candidate, cause or party, but because they so hate the other candidate, cause or party. I'm driven to vote for X because I just have so much antipathy for Y, right? That's the kind of polarization we're dealing with in America right now. And that's actually different than other eras of polarized American politics, right? So there is a bit of a misconception that, we've never been in a hyper-polarized state. That's not true at all. We've lived through eras in American history that were deeply polarized. Now, whether or not the polarization was more negative or positive, I think is what many political scientists are interested in, right? There, of course, have been periods of time in which you have such strong loyalty, this base to this party, this other base to this other party, out of love, fealty, strong commitment to their ideas or institutions or policy approaches. But then you also have instances of polarization that are drawn, let's call it what it is, more by loathing, hatred, concern, worry, angst about the other. And I think that's where we are right now, or there's a worry that that's deepening in the United States right now. Another thing that I think connects to the polarization point, where is this return to normalcy that we were all promised? Right? In 2019 and 2020, this was one of the most popular slogans for some Americans and for some politicians, that if only we kind of turn the page on certain individuals and certain movements in the United States, that we would have a return to normalcy. I think it's fair to say in 2024 that from 2020 to now, we have not returned to normal. Now, what's fascinating is that exact paradigm, that kind of election promise and then early attempt to follow through, this is not the first time we've seen this in American presidential politics. In fact, this was basically the slogan of Warren G. Harding in 1920. Right? The United States had gone through 8 years of a Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. We had just finished World War I, coming out of the first Red Scare. A lot was changing in America. And here we have a politician of the opposing party, the Republican Party, that basically runs as, let's go back to the pre-war era. Let's return to normal. And this was the big promise during the Harding years. This was also the big promise in 2020, and 2021, and 2022, that maybe we could course correct and go back to something quote unquote normal. I don't think that's the case. I don't think we've accomplished that. So it's been a polarized election cycle. But the other adjective that I used is that it's been an unprecedented electoral cycle. And I want to focus on the ways that it's unprecedented, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. Once again, this is not pertaining to 2 days ago. This is not pertaining to a week ago. This is kind of the overarching primary and general election, things that really are going to distinguish it, things we're going to remember, things that are going to be analyzed by historians and social scientists moving forward. On the Republican side, Donald Trump lost in 2020, and there are immediate questions, both within the Republican Party and outside. What did that mean for Trumpism? What did that mean personally for Donald Trump? And then what did that mean for Trumpism? There were questions about whether or not the Republican Party would be able to kind of reconsolidate around different faction, whether or not Donald Trump would do the same thing that other first-term presidents who had lost did, which is go into other fields, right? Last time I checked, Jimmy Carter didn't run for re-election in 1984, right? This isn't something we saw George H.W. Bush doing in 1996. So maybe this would be what happened to Trump. First-term president, didn't win re-election. Maybe he went back to Manhattan or something. Went back to running his businesses. So there is a question mark. Like, what was the staying power of Trump and Trumpism going to be? And I remember even when the Republican presidential primary season started, it was not a fait accompli that Donald Trump was going to ice out everyone. It wasn't. If you were to look at poll numbers in the fall, and even the summer, but more so the fall of 2023, you would see that there were some contenders, and there were also some big campaign donors that were willing to throw money at people not named Donald Trump. There's a distinct possibility during the early stages of the primary and caucus process that someone not named Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee for president. But then things became pretty monolithic pretty quickly, did they not? I mean, the Iowa caucuses were pretty definitively for Trump, as were the New Hampshire primaries. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the first time in modern presidential primary history that a Republican candidate has won the Iowa caucuses and the New Hampshire primaries and then gone to Nevada and won too. All challengers sidelined. The staying power of Trumpism and the staying power of Donald Trump is something that is unprecedented, truly unprecedented. But what was Donald Trump trying to do? He was trying to do something that only one president had ever done, which is win the White House, lose it, stay around for long enough, and have a strong enough hold on his party that he could win it back. This only happened once. Grover Cleveland, almost 130 years ago, did it, right? Talk about unprecedented. If you lose the White House, you're just not going to win it back, right? This does not happen in American politics. It's only ever happened one time. And then political violence. There were 2 assassination attempts on a presidential candidate over the past 4 months. Right. So staying power of Trump, big question mark after he loses in 2020. The hope of being Grover Cleveland 2.0. And then the political violence and the assassination attempts on the candidate. Elements of the election cycle that are unprecedented as it relates to the Republican side. Now let's look at the Democratic side. There's a truism within political science that debates don't matter. Let's kind of put that the way of the dinosaur, shall we? Or I should be more charitable. The official take for a long time within political science is that presidential debates do matter, but they don't matter in the way that many people think they matter. They matter in the sense that, you know what, if you get a good zinger in, you get a good sound bite, you can repackage that as an ad and toss it across the country, use it again and again and again, right? So maybe this will help with advertising. Maybe there have been some donors who've been sitting on the sideline because they're not sure that you're a viable candidate and they want to see you in action. They actually want to see how you spar against an opponent. And it's only after a good debate performance, it's only after good media coverage that they say, okay, I'll get off the sideline and I will donate to your candidacy. Right? But this idea that tens of millions of Americans are just waiting to see how you do on debate night, everyone's tuning in and they change their mind, that more often than not has been a fantasy. So people oftentimes just say, oh, debates don't matter. And then the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump happened, and people realized that debates do matter. Right. So the incumbent president of the United States, not so long, just a few weeks after a poor debate performance, drops out of the race. And here's where a bit of controversy, and I'm certain in the weeks, months, years ahead, enduring controversy and debate will be had, which is how that shift from Joe Biden stepping out of the presidential race to Kamala Harris becoming the Democratic nominee, how that shift took place and whether or not a different set of steps could have been taken, ought to have been taken by the party. Right? Kamala Harris ran for president in 2019. Her campaign did not make it to 2020. She did not make it to the first caucus, the Iowa caucus. She did not run against her boss in the 2024 presidential cycle. So she did not compete in a primary or a caucus in 2020 or in 2024. But upon dropping out of the race, Joe Biden officially endorsed her as the candidate, and quickly we saw consolidation around her candidacy. Now there was talk of maybe having a truncated primary, a mini primary, maybe a set of debates at the DNC where 4, 5, 6 different candidates could kind of fight it out, and we'll see what the convention delegates want. That didn't happen. Very quickly, just within days of Joe Biden leaving the race, we see movement, support, rallying around Kamala Harris as the nominee. So this is controversial, right? This is controversial. Historically, there have been about 2 modes of selecting presidential nominees within a party. One is the classic backroom deal, right? Party brokers decide this is the person that's running. They look across the land and they think that this is the candidate that they deem to be the most successful or being the most viable. The second and the most common after the McGovern-Fraser reforms of the early 1970s is that we have primaries and caucuses to kind of battle it out, and one candidate will emerge. Note that neither of those 2 things happened when it came to the nomination of Kamala Harris. This was controversial. It will remain controversial. And then, coming back to an early surprise that was brought up by an audience member, something also that's unprecedented. You know, here we have a woman who potentially could become the first woman president, first black woman president, the first Asian American president. Unprecedented. Unprecedented. So, a polarized election cycle, but also an unprecedented election cycle, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. And that's all before this week. Okay. Next thing I want to bring up before we get to election night is maybe like the closing messages of the 2 camps. A lot's been made of this over the past 2 days. Maybe it's been over-theorized. I doubt it. I bet it will continue to be theorized. How did these 2 camps end their campaigns? What kind of messages, slogans, outreach did we see Kamala Harris doing? Did we see Donald Trump doing? Closing messages. Let's start on the Harris side. I was struck by this move towards bipartisanship. If you were to have told me a few months ago that in the closing weeks of the general election, you would have the Democratic candidate going state to state to state with Liz Cheney and touting Liz Cheney's endorsement and Dick Cheney's endorsement. And if you were to listen to some of these rallies and some of these events, these conversations with Liz Cheney, the explicit message is, I'm going to try to peel off some erstwhile Republicans. I'm going to peel off some more moderate Republicans. That's a strategy, right? That's a gamble. We now know that the percentage of Republicans that voted for Kamala Harris is less than the percentage of Republicans that voted for Joe Biden in 2020. But that was a gamble, right? This attempted bipartisanship. And I think driving some of that hope was the issue of abortion, right? After the Dobbs decision, Democrats believed that this was a topic that could win them congressional races, senatorial races, and now maybe even the presidency. Right? Look at the midterm elections in 2022. Democrats didn't fare as badly as they'd expected, and they also pumped millions of dollars into abortion advertising. After all the counting has been done, I am certain that Democrats will have spent more than $100 million on abortion advertising in the 2024 election cycle. And the belief is that there are independents, there are moderate Republicans that don't like what the Supreme Court did, but also don't like some highly restrictive state laws around abortion that have been passed since Dobbs, such as in Iowa. And that they could be mobilized on that one issue front. Another closing message. Fitness, character, right? This is an interesting hope. This is an interesting gamble as well. Some closing ads, some closing speeches by Harris, focusing once more on the threat to democracy. Do you want to preserve democracy? If so, vote like it. The number of times you heard either Harris or surrogates for Harris saying that democracy was on the line, that we had a reasonable threat to democracy here, and it was imperative that someone of high character, someone who was protective of democratic norms, was elected. It was one of those commonplace refrains in the closing weeks of the election. Now, as far as tone, or as my students would say, the vibes, right? The closing message was much more optimistic, much more optimistic. Some of the TV ads in the closing weeks focusing on a new chapter, right? America moving forward, not backward. Right? A lot has been made about the quote-unquote politics of joy, right? Optimism, joy, moving forward. Moving forward from Joe Biden or moving forward from Donald Trump? You know, let's keep that hazy, but like, it's a new chapter, right? And the note is more optimistic. This is the closing message. Couldn't be more dissimilar from Donald Trump's closing message. If you were to look at the Madison Square Garden rally, if you were to look at several of the last interviews conducted with Donald Trump, he's hammering away at two issues: the economy and immigration, the economy and immigration, the economy and immigration, believing that these two issues are going to lead him back to the White House. He decides to go on Joe Rogan. Right? This is one of the biggest podcasts in the United States that appeals directly to young voters, to working class voters, to male voters, and to a lot of people who do not vote. Right? And the day of the election, Joe Rogan endorsed Donald Trump. Right? Once again, that's a strategy. That's a gamble. What kind of voters are you going to get? You're trying to mobilize your base, but you're also trying to get new voters. Who are those new voters going to be? Are they going to be low propensity voters? First-time voters? Young voters? This was a hope by Trump. Now, the tone, the vibes, it became increasingly vulgar, saying things that I would never say in front of a classroom setting for fear that I might lose my job. Right? Vulgar things were said, and much more pessimistic about the direction that the United States was in. Now, I will say, that pessimistic note, it was interpreted differently by different media outlets. The Trump camp would say that the reason that Donald Trump was being very pessimistic, fire and brimstone in his closing message, is because we saw voters by 3 out of 4 margins, right? 3/4 margins to 4/5 margins, saying that they were dissatisfied of the direction the nation is going in. 70, 75, 80% of Americans saying they're dissatisfied with the nation's direction. So by tapping into that, by having a much darker, more cynical, more pessimistic voice, Trump hoped to capitalize on Election Day. All right, 2 very different closing messages. And Another reason why I want to focus on the closing messages is because there's another misconception that I want to disabuse everyone of in the closing stages of this election, which is everyone knows who Donald Trump is. They've known who he is ever since Celebrity Apprentice. If not then, you've at least known who he is ever since he ran for president in 2015, 2016. Everyone knows who he is. Everyone has an opinion on him. Nothing is new under the sun. People know who Kamala Harris is. She's been a senator, she ran for president, she's been the vice president for the past 3.5 years. People know who these individuals are. There aren't a lot of undecided voters. Wrong. Actually, there's some fascinating data that came out in October that showed there were still 10-15% of Americans didn't know who they wanted to vote for, or even if they're going to vote. Right? A disproportionately large number of what are called double haters, which is just a cat, I just love that name, by the way, just double hater. People who say, I hate this candidate, and I also hate that candidate. Right? Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to stay home? Are they going to bite their lip and go into the voting booth and pick one out of the two? Maybe they're going to vote third party. You don't know what that demographic is going to do. So the reason I'm focusing on closing messages is because there was a significant chunk of Americans that did not know what they were going to do a month ago. Did not know what they were going to do a few weeks ago. Don't let anyone tell you that, America had already made up its mind a month ago. They had not. They had not, or at least a chunk of Americans had not. All right, we good? Questions? Yes?
Do you know the percentage of voters overall and how that compares to the percentage of voters in past elections, presidential elections?
How many people voted?
Approximately.
So it's looking very similar to 2020 numbers. It's looking very similar to 2020 numbers. However, as we'll get to in a few minutes, the share of the vote that Donald Trump has claimed has grown every election cycle. He got a larger share of the vote in 2024 than he got in 2020. And he got a larger share in 2020 than he got in 2016. Which is interesting because I remember where I was the days and weeks after he won in 2016. And there was a discourse, a not uncommon discourse, both within the media but also within academia that said, this was a fluke election. You're not going to see anything like it. There is no such thing as Trumpism. Here you had a strange, charlatan, iconoclastic figure who was just able to break through in a few states that no one imagined him breaking through in. That's not the kind of argument that people are making about Trumpism anymore. Yeah.
Another question. With the way that Harris got the candidacy, do you see that as a precedent for future presidency by the Democrats as going that route, or?
It's such a unique scenario. Once again, it was predicated on a few things. A president who's in office, who has already secured enough convention delegates to be the nominee, who then decides to drop out very late. And then there's uncertainty about what to do next. A lot has been made about the potential parallels between what Joe Biden did and what LBJ did in 1968. I think that a lot of those are overdrawn. For instance, LBJ told the American people in a TV broadcast that he would not be running for or accept his party's nomination. And then they went to the DNC convention in Chicago and they hashed it out. It was a very ugly convention, but they hashed it out. And there were competing candidates, and the candidates of some blocks did not do as well as they had thought. That led to violence, both within the convention and outside in the streets of Chicago. But the point is, there was an actual debate, discussion, fight at the convention between different candidates. And that's not what we saw here. Yeah.
Didn't LBJ drop out quite a bit earlier?
He did drop out earlier, yeah.
So I think that might have something to do with it, maybe.
True, and we did not have the modern primary and caucus system then. Right. So this is another bugbear that people had at Chicago in 1968, which is the number of pledged delegates and the role of primaries in actually determining who the candidate would be. That doesn't actually work the same way as it does today. Today, if you get the majority of pledged delegates, you're going to be the nominee, right?
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you think that, what I call it, illiteracy in a sense, played a role with these people who are undecided? My impression with the work that I do on a daily basis is that we have a lot of people that do not read well and understand what they read. They do not write well, and they believe anything that's on the internet and do not know how to discern. And I'm wondering if that has an effect on some of these undecided groups, if those are a group of basically uninformed, uneducated people.
So in my own political experience, I have found low education, low propensity voters sometimes to make more rational political calculations than my Princeton professors. So I think sometimes it's overdrawn, the connection between maybe political involvement, political expertise, and making rational calculations about the good of one's life or about what's best for their own community. I do believe in what are called information shortcuts, average everyday people making decisions about things that they don't necessarily have great expertise on, but finding the cues and the shortcuts necessary to come to decisions that they would have made if they had had more information. So I generally try not to endorse kind of the ignorant masses, hoi polloi view of American politics.
I just have so many people that I talk to that they believe something
Sure.
and they have not checked it out or researched it at all.
Yeah.
And I really wonder then if people are having major problems reading and understanding information.
Yeah. And I do think that we have seen a destabilization of any sort of epistemological center in the United States. What do I mean by that? We're not drawing on similar sources of information. We don't have uniform methods of communicating facts. The very notions of objectivity, neutrality, fairness are now being challenged, sometimes quite aggressively. And that definitely is playing a role in, I think, the political divides in the United States. That's true. Yeah.
Paul, if I may, I just also heard something on my public radio station on the way driving down here, but when you're talking about the vote totals, and I just checked, as of today, Associated Press says that Trump received 72.8 million in this election, but in 2020 he received 74.2. So he actually received more total votes in 2020 than he did in this election. And of course, he
slightly less, but we still have not counted a lot of ballots. So,
okay.
So we've not counted all ballots in Nevada. Nevada has not been called. We have not counted all the ballots in Arizona. Arizona has not been called. I think it's possible that we'll have slightly less people who participated, but it's very slightly. So the numbers you said are between 74 and 72. Yeah, I mean.
But the flip side is the Democratic candidate in 2020 received more than 80 million votes.
Yeah.
And the Democratic candidate this time received substantially less than 72 million.
So this gets back to my initial point, which is Trump's share is growing over time, even if the total may be staying somewhat static. His share in 2016 is smaller than his share in 2020, which is smaller than his share now. But get out the vote efforts, maybe we're not as effective. You're right. Oftentimes we're looking at, major depression of votes, like 20 million fewer, 50 million. I mean, the kinds of declines that we see between presidential election cycle and midterm election cycle, I still think we're going to see very similar vote counts. It may be down a few million, but I would be surprised if it's down 10%, 8%. Right. I would be surprised. Yeah.
Have you ever read the poem by Yeats called The Second Coming?
Yes.
And to me, that poem is probably the greatest poem of the 20th century.
It's a great poem.
Because he was prophesizing Hitler and Stalin and Mao, and automatically I think of that poem. But I think of Trump in the last election.
Interesting.
The best blackball conviction. That's where I think of like some of these moderate Democrats. While the worst are full of passion and intensity. I just want to know if you had any comments about that.
While you were speaking, one thing that I was thinking of is a big change between Trump running in 2020 and Trump running in 2024
Yeah.
is just the sheer number of criminal and civil cases against him, right? Now, I will say, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, we have a convicted felon who has now just won the presidency. It is not without precedent that someone who has been charged with a crime or convicted of a crime is running for president. Right? The great socialist politician, Eugene Debs, ran for president while in a federal pen.
Yeah, it was all because of his opposition to World War I.
Yeah, his Canton speech, Canton, Ohio speech, that he was charged for violating a federal law that basically prohibited opposition to the draft in World War I. So this is a long-winded way of saying we've had presidential candidates running while being subjected to criminal prosecution, civil prosecution, civil cases, I should say.
But never elected.
But never elected.
Just run.
And here we are.
And president.
Maybe one more and then we'll keep going. Yeah.
So there has been, it appears to be a more right shift worldwide.
Yeah.
Is that, why is that, you think?
A lot of it has to do
I mean,
with sick
a
man.
lot of the fear of the immigrant, in Europe especially.
I think it is true that if you look at European elections since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, certain commonalities have been found that the party in power is having a difficult time maintaining power, and we see the rise of parties that are challenging the status quo, oftentimes far-right parties, and are doing better than they did beforehand. There are inflationary pressures over the past 2-3 years that didn't exist 5 years ago, didn't exist 6-7 years ago. So, I mean, we could go full Hegelian and what world historical forces are pushing us rightward or leftward. I'm going to leave that for a different day. It is true that in one of my courses, we look at the rise of populism over the past 10 years, forces that have led to populism not strictly being an American political phenomenon, but being a worldwide phenomenon. Populism that isn't just isolated to the right, but also left-wing variants of populism that are getting a rebirth in a way that they haven't had for decades. People reaching for ideologies that they didn't reach for a generation ago. Why is that? Yeah, these are important questions. Speaking of questions, questions that I had on election night, there I was, tuned to the TV, things I wanted to know. Things I wanted to know because they would be good markers for what was going to happen later down the line. Markers of what's going to happen not just in presidential politics, but national politics writ large. So first big question I had on election night, how much split ticket voting are we going to see? Split ticket voting. It sounds maybe so pedantic, but it's not. There was a period of American history in which this was so common. You loved your Republican governor, you decided I'm going to write their name in or pull the lever for them, but I'm going to vote for the Democratic president. This was very, very common in earlier epochs. Not as common in recent years. There are certain states in particular that I think Democrats needed to see this, or they were hoping to see this and see this early, right? Because it is a presidential election cycle. We're focusing on who wins the White House. But as I'm going to conclude with later, it's really important to both parties what the political landscape looks like, even if you do inherit the White House. Divided government, unified government. What's going to happen in the Senate? What's going to happen in the House? Now, Republicans were pretty bullish about winning back the Senate, right? Because they saw several vulnerable seats. Ohio, when I was young, Ohio was a battleground state. Now, what happened in this blue wall state was important. Ohio's not a battleground state anymore. J.D. Vance, senator from Ohio. Ohio has moved rightward over the past 10 or so years. But who's the other senator from Ohio not in J.D. Vance? Oh, Sherrod Brown also has been there for a while. Democrat, up for re-election. Democrat Party threw a lot of money in that race, hoping that he didn't lose his seat. banking on the fact that there would be split ticket voting in Ohio. Yes, Ohio was going to go to Trump. But was there enough of a groundswell of support for Brown to keep him as the senator? People voting for Trump, but also shared Brown, right? Another calculus, westward in Montana. It was a done deal. Trump was going to win Montana, right? You can bet the farm on that. He was going to win Montana. But what about John Tester? Popular long-term senator in the state, Democrat. Right? He had a lot of money pumped in the state to protect his seat. Is it possible that Montana could go for Trump, but Tester, the Democratic senator, still wins? Some of the more sanguine Democrats were even looking at Texas. Now, is this the year that maybe Ted Cruz gets ousted? 6 years ago, Beto O'Rourke challenged Ted Cruz, and at the time, that was the most expensive Senate race in American history. Beto brought in a lot of money. People thought they'd be able to beat Ted. They did not beat Ted. All right, what about this year? Colin Allred. If you look at some of the summer polling, going into the fall polling, Allred seemed to be ticking up. Maybe there's a possibility. Democrats thought, yeah, Texas is going to go for Trump, but Ted Cruz, vulnerable seat, maybe, right? So I was looking at split ticket voting. Democrats, I think in particular, were worried about not enough split ticket voting, which could lose them the Senate. I was also interested in what the top policy issues were going to be in the exit polls, because as I highlighted earlier, we saw a big divide here between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats pressing certain issues that they wanted to be front and center for voters. Questions of preserving democracy, questions of abortion, right? Questions of moral fitness, leadership. Republicans thought that their best bet was elsewhere. The economy, inflation, immigration, maybe disenchanted voters who are upset at what's happened in foreign policy. You know, it's one of those truisms of politics that many voters don't vote on. Many presidential voters don't vote on the basis of foreign policy, but 5%, 10%, enough upset about what's happening in Ukraine, enough upset about what's happening in Gaza. What about in areas of the country that have larger Arab American communities? I'm thinking here of areas in Michigan, for example. Could you peel some voters off there? Spoiler, they did. But what's going to be most important to voters when they leave the ballot booth and they come out and say, I voted on the basis of X? What's that X going to be? Right. That was going to be a tell for me. What were the priorities for voters this election cycle? Because Democrats wanted them to be one thing, and Republicans wanted them to be another. Next thing, how close? And when we talk about this in my class, we always think about how close in terms of like just raw vote count, right? As if our presidential system was determined by national popular vote. It's not. But I want to know, yes, poll after poll after poll after poll nationally showed it neck and neck. It was neck and neck, neck and neck. But neck and neck in a popular vote tells me nothing about what's going to happen in the Electoral College. And sure enough, we knew who won the presidency by the time I went to bed on Wednesday morning, right? So I was interested in how close was this going to be. We knew it was going to be close in the popular vote, but did that tell us how close it was going to be in the Electoral College? There are 7 battleground states, 7. 2 in the southeast, Georgia and North Carolina. Then you had the blue wall. Pennsylvania, not Ohio anymore, used to be one, but not anymore. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. And then go to the southwest, the slow counters, the ones we're still waiting on right now. Nevada, Arizona, 7 battleground states. Now, we knew nationally it was going to be pretty close. Even 1%, 2%, 3%, it was possible. Very close in kind of the raw count. But what if a candidate swept all 7? Well, then it won't be very close in the Electoral College. Spoiler, this is what it looks like is happening. Right. As of right now, 5 of those battleground states have gone for Donald Trump. The last 2, we still don't know. I imagine it will take some time, some weeks. No, some days, I should say, some days. Right now, right before I checked, before coming in, Donald Trump leading both in Arizona and Nevada. The money would be on him sweeping all 7 of the battleground states, which puts us in a position of kind of 2016, somewhat close, National popular vote, not so close electoral college vote. Not so close, and we even knew the night of. So that was something I was interested in. How close would this be? Not strictly in the popular vote, but how close would it be electoral college? Yes?
Since you brought up the electoral college.
Yeah.
Is this an anachronism from the past? Do we still need it? Why or why not? You keep seeing more and more, like why do we have this commentary out there?
We break up in class, and I have the pros and the cons here, right? We have the students defending, we have the students opposing. Now, if I may, like there's the principled argument for or against, but there's also the self-interested argument for or against, right? So the number of students that I put this to who dislike the Electoral College, but I asked them if Kamala Harris had had lost the popular vote, which she's likely to do, but she had won the battleground states, would you still hate the Electoral College? So are we principled about our opposition or support, or is it just that in recent cycles, whenever the popular vote loser wins the Electoral College, it's always helping one party? So if in 2000 it had been Al Gore who won the Electoral College but had lost the popular vote, and if in 2016 it had been Hillary Clinton who lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College, I wonder whether or not there'd be as much steam in certain quarters about the Electoral College. Maybe, but my current view is that more often than not, it's partisans that are just pissed that their candidate who lost the Electoral College and won the popular vote didn't get the White House. We can meet after, and I'll share my personal opinions on the Electoral College.
I will just tell you that I was traveling in Canada in September, and I had several Canadians say, "Why are your elections so darn complicated?"
They are.
And like, I don't know.
They are. They're complicated.
Yeah.
There are complicated methods of voting. This is one of them. Yeah, this is definitely one of them. I guess another thing I was interested in, because I live in the Quad Cities, is would there be a surprise battleground? You know, one of the unfortunate elements of the Electoral College is we end up gravitating to the 5, 6, 7, 8 battleground states every 4 years. There's a disproportionate amount of attention to those states. There's also a disproportionate amount of polling in those states. So what happens if, there's a state over here, I don't know what to call it, let's call it Iowa. There's a state over here, and because it's not deemed to be a battleground state, and because neither of the two candidates are spending an astronomical amount of money in the state, there's not a lot of polling there. And then surprise, surprise, it's the week of the election, and you get a Des Moines Registry poll that says Kamala Harris is leading. Oh, same day as an Emerson College poll comes out and says Trump's winning by double digits. So, which is it? So that was another thing, maybe like back in the mind I was wondering, is there going to be a surprise battleground that no one was focusing on? There was a lot of attention, I think, locally here, like, is Iowa actually closer than either camp gave it credit for? I should note, when that Des Moines Register poll came out, the Trump camp immediately said, that's not consistent with our internals, this is a poorly done poll, we have him up by a lot. And here we are now, and he did better in Iowa than he did in 2020 and 2016. So, was there going to be a surprise battleground? There was not. But I'll even put an asterisk there, because that's actually one of my takeaways in a minute. And the next thing, can't talk about American politics without talking about this, money. Money. Will it pay off for the Democrats? Will it pay off for the Democrats? The Democrats had more money and outspent the GOP in every battleground state. All 7 battleground states, the Harris campaign outspent the Trump campaign. The last quarter of fundraising for the Harris campaign actually brought in more money than any quarter of campaign fundraising in American presidential history. Right? It's highly likely, after everything that's been counted, that the Harris campaign spent more money than any presidential campaign in history. So, I was interested. Money. What did it buy? What's it gonna buy? Yeah.
Where did political action committees fit into that narrative? Because
So there's an
a lot of
entire,
money there too.
yeah, there's an entire constellation of funders, you're right. Those that are giving to a campaign, those that are giving to a party. There are PACs, there are super PACs. But the most recent ad counts that I've looked at show very clearly that the Harris camp had more money than the Trump camp.
Even with Musk putting in all that money.
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
But do you think that that's because the Trump campaign didn't have to spend as much money because they already knew the negative, dark feed that was out there, and they just needed to get that rolling, and they didn't really have to. She could have spent more of her time talking up her issues as opposed to just dwelling on the one issue.
It's possible. It's absolutely possible. It is true that in October there were reports that Trump was absolutely livid with his campaign for not bringing more money in, that he did not have enough money, that he was going back to donors asking for more money because they thought they were being outspent. They thought they were being outspent in the states that matter, that they did not have as many ads, they did not have the ads where they wanted them to, they just didn't have as many people on the ground. But you're right, obviously it did not matter. All right, so let me just quickly answer those questions and then tell you some other takeaways from the night that I have. Yeah. Split ticket voting. Did it happen? Not how the Democrats wanted it to happen. What happens to John Tester in Montana? He loses. What happens to Sherrod Brown in Ohio? He loses. What happens to Ted Cruz in Texas? He wins. That guy keeps winning, right? Right. Now, we did see some interesting split ticket voting. I mean, how about this? The only Palestinian American member of Congress, Rashida Tlaib, wins Dearborn, Michigan, the most heavily Arab American community in the United States, by twice the percent that Kamala Harris gets in Dearborn. That's some split ticket voting. Donald Trump wins Dearborn, but Rashida Tlaib, a left-wing, DSA-supported socialist, gets twice the vote count of Kamala Harris. So we see some split ticket voting, not to the Democrats' liking. We see some split ticket voting in the Iowa 1st. Donald Trump wins by double digits in the state of Iowa, but right now, the Iowa 1st has still not been called. There are some Bohannon voters who voted for Donald Trump.
It was called.
What?
I thought it was called.
So, as of this morning, it had not been called.
Miller's.
But, I mean, she declared victory. But once again, Bohannon has 3 days to call for a recount if she wants to. It's within the margin that she could call for a recount and she wouldn't have to pay for it. Okay. So, top policy issues, what were they going to be? Ended up being issues both of democracy, but also the economy. Right? Those are the top two issues. So both sides get something that they want. Right? I remember that early exit polling coming out of North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania. Democrats are not displeased that these are the top two. They thought that maybe because of the high number of Americans that are worried about the preservation of democracy, maybe they'd be okay. How close? This will be the first time that Donald Trump wins the popular vote. And it's not very close in the Electoral College, but near the night of. 7 battleground states, we only know 5 of the results so far. And in those 5 states, Donald Trump wins, and he's leading in the last 2, Arizona and Nevada. Surprise battlegrounds, kind of, but not the ones that people were focusing on. I spent several years living in New Jersey, a state that went for Democrats by 15%, 20%, 15%, 20%. This time, New Jersey went for Harris by 5%. New Jersey was more of a battleground than Iowa. New Jersey. I would be shocked if the Trump campaign spent $20 in New Jersey. I'm being facetious, but still. In the state of Illinois, it was a closer race than the state of Iowa. Did we hear that? It was single digit in Illinois. It was a closer race, presidential race in Illinois than it was in Iowa. What the heck? Something that I'm interested in, I'd be interested in the counterfactual here. I'm going to need to look into the data even more. What would have happened to Minnesota if Walz had not been the VP nom? Minnesota was down to 4%. Harris won by 4% in Minnesota.
I heard the New York City boroughs were also like
did.
Illinois.
Yeah, we're doing quite well.
Yeah.
So we see rightward movement. We see some surprise battleground states, but not the ones that many people were expecting. Some additional takeaways just very quickly. I'm always interested when battlegrounds become battlegrounds no more. I remember the 2000 presidential election. It was the first election that I was really politically conscious. Neck and neck in Florida. Fast forward a few election cycles, it was really important. The Trump campaign thought in 2016 that they win Florida, and they won it by a hair. They won it by 1%. Yeah, Florida was called for Trump the hour of polling closing, right? Florida is not a battleground state anymore. They went for Trump by double digits. Iowa, big battleground state. Trump is growing his lead in Iowa, 8%, 9%, now double digits. Battlegrounds no more. Something that I just highlighted, the rightward movement everywhere, even in urban areas. There is a big hope within the Harris campaign that the suburbs would go for Harris. As of now, exit polling shows that the suburbs went for Trump. Trump is getting a higher percentage each election, and we're seeing county after county move to the right. Now, exit polling on the most important presidential qualities. Ma'am, this was actually the question that you brought up earlier. One of the questions that's offered, what qualities do you want in a president? The top two qualities listed were ability to lead and can bring needed change. And Trump won by a mile in both of those categories for voters that thought that those two qualities were important. Moral fitness was not in top two. One thing that I keep on coming back to is the difficulty that Harris had in running away from Biden's current unpopularity. So it's been brought up now a few times over the past few days that there has never been an incumbent president's party that has won the White House when the incumbent president has as low of approval numbers as Biden has. That's hard. That's hard. In a televised interview, Kamala Harris was asked, what would she have done differently if she had had this administration instead of Biden? Where would she have parted ways? And she said, I can't think of anywhere. Right? This is just a really hard position for the sitting VP to be in. This is her current boss. She's still in the administration. It was really hard, I think, for the Harris campaign to move away from Biden's unpopularity. He's been stuck in the 30s, low 40s as far as popularity for months and months now. And it was hard for her to get away from that. Dissatisfaction with the nation's direction, sitting at 70, 75, 80%. That's hard if you are deemed to be part of the administration, part of the status quo. Voters said they wanted quote-unquote change. A large number of voters said that they wanted a change candidate, and they thought that a former president was a change candidate over Kamala Harris, which is interesting and will be dissected moving forward. Massive education and gender divides. Underline, underline, underline. Those with a college education voted differently than those without a college education. Males and females voted differently. A lot had been made about what the gender divide was going to look like in this election. I should note, Harris did worse with women than Joe Biden did in 2020. There was a gender divide, there was an education divide, but Harris was not able to do as well with women as she had hoped. Last few things I'll say. Massive income divides here. Massive income divides. Those voters who are in a household making less than $100,000 broke decisively for Trump. Households where you're making $100,000 or more broke decisively for Harris. Wow. Big income divides here. Working class Americans voted more likely than not for Donald Trump. More affluent Americans voted more likely than not for Harris. We see a greater share of union support for the GOP than we've seen in a long time. You now have people like J.D. Vance and Donald Trump and Josh Hawley going around the country saying, we're the working class party, and here's the data to show it. And Democrats are going to have to push back against that messaging. It's hard when you have numbers that show that those that are making working class money are not voting for your party. And then maybe a bit of a historical note. In 2008, a lot was made about the new Democratic coalition. What was going to happen to the formation of this durable majority coalition under Barack Obama? It's going to be bringing in diverse Americans, bringing in young Americans, bringing in women, and also keeping traditional Democratic support. This was viewed as the hope of a new Democratic coalition. Once again, young, diverse, lots of women, and also maintaining traditional Democratic bases of support. Here we are 16 years later, and these same groups are moving in the opposite direction. The 2008 New Democratic Coalition that many people had banked on is actually going in the opposite direction. Trump made inroads with non-white voters, especially Latinos. He made inroads with young voters, and he actually beat Kamala Harris with first-time voters. This is where like the fine-grained details can be really important. Is maybe 1% higher than the exit polling or 2% lower than the exit polling, but current exit polling indicates that Donald Trump will have received a higher share of the Latino vote than any modern Republican president. Okay? And I suppose I'll leave it with the question of Trumpism. In 2016, some viewed it as a fluke. It was based on a strange way of electing a president. Now I think we have to view Trumpism as one of the most important generational forces within American politics. He has staying power. He's been in 3 straight elections. We have not seen that since FDR. He was ousted from office and now won the popular vote. Trumpism is one of the generational forces that are really kind of determining the landscape of our political system. And on that happy note.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking Dr. Paul Baumgardner?